The rain came down in sheets over Pearl Harbor that November morning in 1943, drumming against the tin roof of the small office at the edge of the naval yard. Inside, Eleanor Hawkins sat alone at a wooden desk scarred by years of use, her fingers stained with India ink, her eyes red from lack of sleep. The room smelled of paper, salt air, and the faint trace of her husband's cologne, a phantom she couldn't shake, even though Thomas had been gone for 16 months. 16 months since the USS Grayling went down somewhere in the South Pacific. 16 months since the Navy telegram arrived with its cold, bureaucratic sympathy. 16 months since Eleanor stopped being a Navy wife and became something else entirely, a widow with a mission. On the desk before her lay what looked like madness to anyone who didn't understand. Sheets upon sheets of graph paper covered in careful notations, depth calculations, pressure formulas, and hand-drawn curves that spiraled and intersected like some strange mathematical art. This wasn't grief therapy. This was revenge against the ocean that had taken Thomas. This was her war. Eleanor had been a mathematics teacher before the war, before Thomas shipped out on that submarine, before everything changed. She understood numbers in a way most people didn't, how they could predict, protect, save lives. And she knew, with a certainty that burned in her chest, that Thomas and his crew hadn't died because of enemy action. They died because of something far more insidious, incomplete decompression data. The Navy's official diving charts were rudimentary at best, cobbled together from commercial diving tables designed for shallow water work, not for the deep emergency ascents that combat submarines were increasingly forced to make. Eleanor had Thomas's letters, the ones he'd written before the final patrol, where he'd mentioned concerns about the numbers not adding up when crews had to blow ballast and shoot to the surface under attack. She had the testimony of survivors from other boats, men who'd watched shipmates die from the bends, nitrogen bubbles forming in blood and tissue, agony that could kill or cripple. The Navy had diving tables. But they were wrong. And Eleanor was going to fix them. Outside, through the rain-streaked window, she could see the submarine pens where the boats of Submarine Squadron 4 were preparing for their next war patrol. 12 submarines. Nearly 700 men. All of them relying on charts that Eleanor knew were fundamentally flawed, based on incomplete data that hadn't accounted for the extreme conditions of combat diving. She'd spent the past year collecting every scrap of information she could find. Medical reports from naval hospitals where divers had been treated for decompression sickness. Engineering specifications for submarine ballast systems. Physiological data from civilian diving operations. She'd corresponded with doctors, with engineers, with anyone who would take a widow seriously. Most hadn't. But a few had, and slowly, painfully, she'd begun to build something new. The door opened without warning. Eleanor looked up to see Commander Robert Ashford standing in the doorway, water dripping from his rain slicker, his face drawn with exhaustion. He was the executive officer of Squadron 4, a career submariner with 20 years in the Navy and the kind of weathered face that came from too many war patrols. He shouldn't have been here. He should have been with his boats. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said quietly, "we need to talk." Eleanor stood, her heart suddenly racing. Something in his voice, in the way he carried himself, told her this wasn't a social call. "What's happened?" Ashford stepped inside, closed the door behind him. His eyes swept over the papers on her desk, taking in the careful calculations, the hand-drawn graphs. "The Scorpion," he said. "Commander Harrison's boat. They're 18 hours overdue from a training dive. We've got search planes up, but—" He trailed off, jaw tight. "We don't know if it's mechanical failure, enemy action, or if they tried an emergency ascent and ran into trouble." The words hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. The Scorpion. She knew that boat. Knew some of the men aboard. Knew that if they'd attempted a rapid ascent from depth, the Navy's current diving tables would have told them to surface too fast, to risk their lives on calculations that were fundamentally incomplete. How deep were they diving? She asked. 400 feet. Maximum depth test. Eleanor's hands moved before she could think, pulling her own charts from the stack on her desk. 400 feet. The pressure at that depth was nearly 12 atmospheres. If they'd had to surface quickly, if they'd followed the Navy's standard decompression schedule. "Commander," she said, her voice steady despite the terror building in her chest. If they tried to come up using the standard tables, they'd surface in approximately 12 minutes. At that depth, with that ascent rate, the nitrogen saturation in their blood would— "I know what it would do," Ashford cut her off. His eyes met hers, and she saw something there she hadn't expected. Belief. "That's why I'm here. The rest of the squadron is scheduled for deep dive exercises starting in 48 hours. Every boat. We're testing new emergency ascent procedures in case we have to surface quickly under attack. And I need to know." He paused, seemed to make a decision. "I need to know if your calculations are real." Eleanor felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders. This was the moment. This was what all those sleepless nights, all those ink-stained fingers, all that grief channeled into mathematics had been building toward. The Navy had ignored her for months, dismissed her as a grieving widow playing at science. But Ashford was here. Ashford was asking. "They're real," she said. "More real than what you're using now. The Navy's current tables assume a linear relationship between depth and ascent time. But decompression doesn't work that way. The human body absorbs nitrogen according to a logarithmic curve, and the deeper you go, the more critical the timing becomes. I've calculated safe ascent profiles for depths up to 500 feet, with staging stops that account for actual tissue saturation rates." She spread her charts across the desk, complex graphs showing depth versus time, with careful notations for mandatory decompression stops, for gas bubble formation thresholds, for the razor-thin margin between life and death. It looked homemade because it was. No official Navy letterhead, no stamp of bureaucratic approval. Just a widow's desperate attempt to keep other women from joining her club. Ashford studied the charts in silence. Outside, the rain intensified, hammering the roof like artillery. Finally, he looked up. "Can you make copies?" "Enough for 12 boats." "I can." "But, Commander—" Eleanor's voice caught slightly. "If the Scorpion is out there, if they're waiting at depth because they know something's wrong with their ascent calculations, then they've got maybe another 6 hours of air," Ashford finished grimly. "After that, they surface no matter what the numbers say. And if the numbers are wrong—" He didn't need to finish. Eleanor looked down at her hands, at the ink stains that never seemed to wash away completely, at the wedding ring she still wore. Thomas was gone. But she could still save his brothers. She could still fight this war her own way. "I'll need access to a mimeograph machine," she said. "And I'll need it now." Ashford nodded once, sharply. "You'll have it. Whatever you need." He turned toward the door, then paused. "Mrs. Hawkins? The Navy didn't listen to you before. If these charts work, if they bring even one crew home safe, I'll make damn sure they listen next time." As he disappeared back into the rain, Eleanor sat down and began to work. Outside, somewhere in the dark Pacific, the Scorpion was waiting. And all across Pearl Harbor, 12 more submarines were preparing to dive deep into waters where the margin for error was measured in minutes, in pounds per square inch, in the delicate chemistry of blood and breath. She had 48 hours to make sure they all came back alive. The clock was already ticking. By midnight, Eleanor had produced 73 copies of her diving charts. Her hands were cramped from cranking the mimeograph machine, her clothes stained purple from the ink, her eyes burning from exhaustion. But every chart was perfect, clear, readable, with depth markings at 25-foot intervals and time calculations accurate to the minute. She'd triple-checked every number, knowing that a single error could mean the difference between a safe ascent and a coffin full of twisted, agonized bodies. Commander Ashford had returned just after 2200 hours with a warrant officer and a truck. They'd loaded the charts without ceremony, without fanfare. This wasn't official. This was desperation dressed up as initiative, a career officer betting everything on a widow's mathematics because the alternative was watching men die according to regulations. Now, at 0130 hours, Eleanor sat in a Navy staff car as it crawled through the blacked-out streets of Pearl Harbor toward the submarine pens. Ashford had insisted she come, had said something about standing by in case there are questions. But Eleanor knew the real reason. If this went wrong, if her calculations killed someone, he wanted her there to see it. To own it. The submarine base was alive with controlled chaos. Klieg lights illuminated the pens where the boats were moored, their wet black hulls gleaming like the backs of sleeping whales. Men moved with purpose across gangplanks, loading supplies, running final checks. These were the boats of Squadron 4, preparing for deep-dive exercises that would test their crews and their equipment to the limits of human endurance. And somewhere out there, beyond the harbor entrance, the Scorpion was still missing. "No word," Eleanor asked as they climbed out of the car. Ashford shook his head grimly. Search planes spotted an oil slick this afternoon, about 40 miles southeast of here. Could be diesel fuel from a submerged boat venting tanks, or it could be. He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Both of them knew what oil on the surface might mean. They walked down to the pens, past sailors who glanced at Eleanor with confusion. Women weren't usually found in this part of the base, especially not at this hour. But Ashford's presence cleared the way, his rank opening doors and silencing questions. At Pen 7, the USS Barracuda sat low in the water, her crew making final preparations for the morning's dive. Lieutenant Commander James Reeves, her captain, was on deck speaking with his executive officer when he spotted Ashford approaching. His eyes flicked to Eleanor, then back to Ashford, confusion evident. "Commander? I wasn't expecting." "I need 5 minutes with your crew, Jim," Ashford said. "All of them. Now." Something in his tone killed any argument. Reeves turned and shouted orders, his voice carrying across the deck. Within minutes, the Barracuda's crew was assembled. 68 men in dungarees and oil-stained shirts, faces young and old, eyes tired but alert. These were combat veterans, men who'd survived depth-charge attacks, who'd torpedoed Japanese freighters and lived to tell about it. They didn't assemble lightly. Ashford stepped forward. "Gentlemen, this is Mrs. Eleanor Hawkins. Some of you might remember her husband, Lieutenant Thomas Hawkins, who served aboard the Grayling." A few nods, uncomfortable shuffling. Everyone remembered the Grayling. "Mrs. Hawkins is a mathematician, and she's discovered some serious problems with our current diving tables." The reaction was immediate. Skeptical glances, crossed arms, the subtle body language of men who didn't appreciate civilians, especially women, telling them how to do their jobs. Eleanor had expected this. Had steeled herself for it. "Commander," one of the officers spoke up. Eleanor recognized him as the boat's diving officer, a lieutenant named Stevens. "With respect, we've been using the Navy's diving tables for years. They're based on decades of research." "They're based on civilian commercial diving data," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the murmur of agreement. "Shallow water work. Salvage operations. Not combat submarines making emergency ascents from 400 feet under attack conditions." The murmuring stopped. She had their attention now. "Your current tables tell you that from 400 feet, you can surface in 12 minutes with a single 3-minute stop at 20 feet. Is that correct?" Stevens nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. That calculation will kill you." Eleanor pulled out one of her charts, holding it up so they could see. "At 400 feet, you're under 12 atmospheres of pressure. Your blood, your tissues, they're saturated with nitrogen at that pressure. When you ascend, that nitrogen has to come out of solution slowly, controlled. If you come up too fast, it forms bubbles in your bloodstream, in your joints, your spine, your brain. The Navy's current tables assume you can off-gas that nitrogen in 12 minutes. You can't. Not safely. Not without risking decompression sickness or death. And you know this how? Stephen's voice had an edge to it. No offense, ma'am, but I know this because I've spent 16 months studying every case of decompression sickness reported in Navy medical records over the past 5 years. I've analyzed the data, cross-referenced it with submarine dive profiles, and calculated the actual nitrogen absorption rates for deep diving. And what I found is that the Navy's tables are off by a factor of nearly 40% at depths below 300 feet. She let that sink in. 40%. Enough to kill. Mrs. Hawkins has developed new charts, Ashford continued. Modified ascent profiles with additional decompression stops. I want every boat in this squadron using them for tomorrow's exercises. The reaction was explosive. Men talking over each other, some angry, some confused. This was protocol violation on a massive scale, using unauthorized diving tables in a military operation. Courts-martial had been convened for less. Commander, we can't, Reeves started. The Scorpion is missing, Ashford said, his voice like iron. The talking stopped. She went down for a deep dive yesterday morning and hasn't come back. Now maybe she's got mechanical trouble. Maybe she's sitting on the bottom waiting for rescue. Or maybe, his eyes swept the assembled crew, maybe Commander Harrison tried to bring her up fast using the standard tables, and now she's a tomb because the numbers we gave him were wrong. Silence. Heavy, terrible silence. I'm not ordering you to use these charts, Ashford continued. I can't. They're not official, they're not approved, and if something goes wrong, it's on me. But I am asking you to look at them, to consider them, and to decide for yourselves whether you trust mathematics or bureaucracy when your life is on the line. Eleanor stepped forward, began distributing the charts to the crew. Some men took them eagerly, already studying the numbers. Others held them like they were contaminated, skeptical and resistant. Stevens took his copy, his face unreadable. These staging stops you're recommending, he said after a moment. 3 minutes at 200 feet, 5 minutes at 100, 10 minutes at 50, and another 10 at 20. That's nearly 30 minutes total ascent time from 400 feet. 4 times longer than current protocol. Yes, Eleanor said simply. That's a lot of air consumption. If we're surfacing in an emergency, if we've been depth-charged and our tanks are compromised. Then you'll have to balance the risk of running out of air against the certainty of getting the bends, Eleanor interrupted. I know it's not perfect. I know it's longer and uses more oxygen. But it's based on how the human body actually works, not on how we wish it worked. Stevens looked at her for a long moment, then down at the chart. His fingers traced the depth lines, the timing marks. Finally, he looked up at Reeves. Skipper, I'd like permission to review these in detail before tomorrow's dive. Reeves hesitated, glanced at Ashford, then nodded slowly. Granted. Meet me in the wardroom in 20 minutes. Bring your calculations. The crew began to disperse, some gathering in small groups to examine the charts, others heading back to their tasks with troubled expressions. Eleanor stood on the deck of the Barracuda, watching them go, feeling the weight of what she'd just done settling on her shoulders. A hand touched her elbow. She turned to find a young sailor, couldn't have been more than 20, with red hair and freckles. Mrs. Hawkins? His voice was quiet. My brother's on the Scorpion. Machinist's mate 2nd class. If your numbers could have helped them. He couldn't finish. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. What's his name? Danny. Danny Morrison. I hope he's okay, she said softly. I hope they all are. The sailor nodded, blinking hard, then turned and disappeared below decks. Ashford appeared at her side. 6 more boats to go, he said. Are you up for it? Eleanor looked out across the harbor, at the black water reflecting the Klieg lights, at the submarines waiting like patient predators. Somewhere out there, the Scorpion was fighting for survival. And tomorrow, 12 more boats would descend into that same darkness, trusting in numbers that might save them or kill them. I'm up for it, she said. They moved to the next pen, and the next, repeating the briefing with each crew. Some were skeptical. Some were angry. But some, the ones who'd lost friends to the bends, who'd seen men crippled by bad ascents, they listened. They studied the charts. They asked questions that Eleanor answered with precision and patience. By 0400 hours, every boat in Squadron 4 had her charts. By 0600 hours, the first submarine was preparing to dive. And by 0700 hours, as the sun rose over Pearl Harbor, Eleanor stood on the pier watching the Barracuda slip beneath the surface, carrying 68 souls and a widow's desperate mathematics down into the crushing dark. The testing was about to begin. 400 feet below the surface, the Barracuda was a steel cylinder of controlled tension. The hull creaked and groaned under 12 atmospheres of pressure, metal flexing in ways the human ear could hear but the mind didn't want to acknowledge. Inside the control room, Lieutenant Commander Reeves stood at the periscope well, his eyes on the depth gauge as the needle crept past 375, 380, 385 feet. Depth 390 feet, the diving officer called out. Trimmed and holding. Very well. Level off at 400. The plainsman worked the controls with practiced precision, adjusting the boat's angle until she hung suspended in the black water like a shark at rest. Around them, the crew went about their tasks with quiet efficiency, but there was a different quality to the silence today. Everyone aboard knew this wasn't just another training dive. This was a test, of the boat, of the procedures, and of a widow's mathematics against the Navy's official doctrine. Stevens, the diving officer, held Eleanor's chart in one hand, comparing it to the Navy's standard tables in the other. The difference was stark. Standard procedure called for a 12-minute ascent with 1 stop. Eleanor's chart showed nearly 30 minutes with 4 mandatory decompression stages. "Skipper," Stevens said quietly, "request permission to use the Hawkins protocol for ascent." Reeves turned, his face unreadable. This was the moment. The choice. Use unauthorized procedures and risk his career, or follow regulations and potentially risk his crew. Every commanding officer's nightmare, wrapped in mathematics and salt water. "You believe in her numbers?" Stevens hesitated. Not because he doubted, but because the weight of the question demanded honesty. "Sir, I ran the calculations twice last night. Her nitrogen absorption curves match the physiological data I've seen from actual decompression cases. The Navy's tables, they work fine for shallow dives, but at this depth, the safety margin is razor thin. Mrs. Hawkins is giving us more margin. At the cost of doubling our ascent time." "Yes, sir." Reeves looked around the control room at his crew. These men had followed him through 3 war patrols, had trusted him with their lives in combat. Now he was asking them to trust a woman they'd never met, charts that weren't in any manual. "All right," he said finally. "We'll do this by the book, her book. Diving officer, prepare to ascend using the Hawkins profile. Slow and steady." And Stevens, "Sir, if this goes sideways, it's on both of us." "Understood, sir." The ascent began at 0730 hours. Slowly, carefully, the Barracuda began to rise. The crew monitored gauges, adjusted ballast, maintained neutral buoyancy as the pressure differential began to shift. At 200 feet, Stevens called for the first stop. "All stop. Hold depth 200 feet." The boat leveled off. 3 minutes at this depth, Eleanor's chart specified. 3 minutes for the nitrogen in their blood to begin off-gassing, for the pressure to equalize. The crew waited, breathing air that was cleaner and easier now than it had been at 400 feet. "Time," Stevens called. 3 minutes, mark, came the response from the timekeeper. Resume ascent. Next stop, 100 feet. Above them, on the surface, Eleanor stood on the deck of the rescue vessel Pigeon, her eyes locked on the patch of ocean where the Barracuda had gone down. Commander Ashford was beside her, stopwatch in hand, tracking the ascent profile against her charts. Around them, Navy divers in heavy suits stood ready, just in case. Just in case the math was wrong. Just in case 68 men suddenly needed emergency medical treatment for decompression sickness. The radio crackled. "Pigeon, this is Barracuda. Holding at 100 feet. All personnel showing normal. No signs of distress." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. Normal. They were normal. The first decompression stop had worked. 5 minutes at this depth, Ashford said quietly, checking her chart. Then 50 feet for 10 minutes, then 20 feet for another 10. The minutes stretched like hours. Eleanor's hands gripped the rail so hard her knuckles turned white. She'd done the calculations 100 times, had checked and rechecked every number. But calculation and reality were different things. Mathematics didn't account for the human cost of being wrong. "Barracuda holding at 50 feet, the radio reported. "Crew condition normal. Some minor ear discomfort, but well within acceptable parameters." 10 minutes. 10 minutes of controlled decompression at 50 feet, the nitrogen bubbling out of blood and tissue in a controlled, non-lethal way. Eleanor had calculated this depth as the critical threshold, shallow enough that the pressure differential was manageable, deep enough that they weren't rushing the process. She looked at the other boats. Across the training area, 6 more submarines were conducting similar dives, all of them using her charts. The Seahawk at 350 feet. The Mako at 300. Each captain had made the choice to trust her mathematics over established protocol. Each crew was betting their lives on a widow's grief turned into science. "Mrs. Hawkins." Ashford's voice pulled her back. "Final stop. 20 feet. 10 minutes." This was it. The last decompression stage before surfacing. If her calculations were wrong, if she'd missed something in the nitrogen absorption curves, this was where they'd find out. Decompression sickness didn't always manifest immediately. Sometimes it waited until the very end, until the pressure dropped to near normal, and then struck like a hammer. Paralysis, stroke, cardiac arrest. Eleanor closed her eyes, saw Thomas's face. Saw the man she'd married, the submariner who'd gone to war and never come home. This was for him. For all of them. Pigeon. Barracuda. Completing final decompression stop. Preparing to surface. Ashford clicked the stopwatch. Right on schedule. Exactly as your chart specified. The ocean began to boil. Foam and spray erupted as the Barracuda's sail broke the surface, water streaming from her sides. The crew began emerging from the hatches, faces turned toward the sun, breathing fresh air for the first time in hours. Eleanor watched through binoculars as the boat's corpsmen appeared on deck, conducting rapid medical checks. Looking for signs of the bends, joint pain, difficulty breathing, neurological symptoms. The corpsman worked methodically through the crew, then turned toward the Pigeon and gave a thumbs up. All clear. Every man healthy. The radio erupted with reports from the other boats. The Seahawk surfacing, crew condition normal. The Mako completing her ascent, no medical issues. One by one, the submarines of Squadron 4 rose from the deep using Eleanor's charts, and one by one, they reported success. "It worked," Ashford said, something like wonder in his voice. "Your numbers worked." Eleanor didn't answer. Couldn't answer. The relief was too overwhelming, the emotion too raw. She'd gambled everything. Her credibility, her husband's memory, the lives of hundreds of men, on calculations done in a small office with a pencil and paper. And it had worked. But before anyone could celebrate, the radio crackled again. Different voice this time. Different boat. All stations, this is USS Scorpion. We are surfacing. Repeat, Scorpion is surfacing. Emergency medical assistance required immediately. Eleanor's head snapped up. The Scorpion. The missing boat. They were alive. Ashford was already shouting orders, directing the Pigeon toward coordinates being broadcast over the radio. The rescue vessel surged forward, engines straining. Around them, every available boat was converging on the position, forming a ring of support around wherever the Scorpion would emerge. "What happened to them?" Eleanor asked. "Where have they been?" "I don't know," Ashford said grimly. "But if they're calling for medical assistance." The implication hung between them. The bends. Decompression sickness. The Scorpion had been missing for over 30 hours. If they'd been forced to hide at depth, if they'd exhausted their air and had to make a desperate ascent, the ocean erupted 200 yards ahead. The Scorpion broke surface at a sharp angle, clearly struggling. Her deck was awash with water, men spilling from the hatches in desperate haste. Even from a distance, Eleanor could see some of them were in bad shape, being carried, supported, one man screaming in agony. The Pigeon pulled alongside, corpsmen already preparing to transfer casualties. Eleanor found herself moving without thinking, following the medical team as they crossed to the submarine. Ashford tried to stop her, but she shook him off. She needed to see. Needed to know. On the Scorpion's deck, chaos. Commander Harrison, the boat's captain, was conscious but clearly in pain, his face gray, his breathing labored. His executive officer was unconscious, being given oxygen. 6 other men showed varying degrees of decompression sickness, joint pain, paralysis in the extremities, one with symptoms of neurological damage. Eleanor knelt beside Harrison as the corpsman worked. "Commander," she said urgently, "how deep were you? How fast did you come up?" Harrison's eyes focused on her with difficulty. 450 feet. Japanese destroyer above us. Couldn't move for 28 hours. Air ran out. Had to surface fast. How fast? 8 minutes. Maybe less. Used standard tables. He coughed, pain racking his body. Knew something was wrong when Jimmy started seizing. But we were out of air. Had to surface or drown. 8 minutes from 450 feet. Eleanor's mind raced through the calculations. At that depth, at that ascent rate, the nitrogen saturation would have been catastrophic. Following the Navy's standard tables from that depth would have been a death sentence. But they'd had no choice. No air meant no time for proper decompression. They'd gambled and paid the price. "Get him to the recompression chamber," she said to the corpsman. "All of them." Immediate hyperbaric treatment. As they loaded Harrison onto a stretcher, he grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. Who are you?" "Eleanor Hawkins. My husband was on the Grayling." Understanding flickered in Harrison's eyes. The calculations. Ashford mentioned, "You have new calculations." "Yes. Would they have saved us?" Eleanor looked at this man who'd brought his boat home through sheer force of will, who'd watched his crew suffer because the numbers he'd been given were wrong. "If you'd had them," she said quietly, "if you'd had time to use them, yes, they would have saved you." Harrison nodded once, then let go as the corpsman carried him away. Eleanor stood on the deck of the Scorpion, surrounded by the evidence of what happened when mathematics failed, when procedure wasn't enough, when the margin of error disappeared and left only prayer and luck. Around her, the rescue operation continued, men being transferred to the Pigeon, medical teams working with desperate efficiency. Ashford appeared at her side. 3 of them might not make it, he said quietly. The corpsmen say the decompression sickness is severe. They'll need days in the chamber, maybe longer. But they're alive, Eleanor said. The boat didn't sink. They're breathing. That's more than the Grayling had. Yes. Ashford looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just a widow but a woman who'd changed the equation. Mrs. Hawkins, what you've done here today, the Navy needs to see this. Needs to understand it. I'm going to make sure they do. Eleanor nodded, too exhausted to feel triumph, too drained to feel anything but relief. Her charts had worked. 12 boats had dived deep and come back safe. The Scorpion had survived, even if some of her crew now fought for their lives. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. And better was all she'd ever asked for. The testing was over. The proof was in the survivors.